All right, so now let's talk about the factory system. So if you wanted a subheading, it would be factory system. So before the invention of the factory, people didn't really work in giant buildings where all the tools were present they needed, all the machines were present that they needed, and everything was produced right there. People worked under what was called the domestic system, which basically they would either work from their home or one person or a couple of people would work together in a smaller building with lower production. So the output of the domestic system was lower per business. Now the factory system, it basically brought all the materials, all the workers, and all the machinery and all the tools together under one roof. And it was a big production. Instead of a couple of people producing chairs, with a factory system, you had hundreds of people producing chairs in one building in one area. So all the workers came together there. And a lot of changes took place with the factory system. For example, the workers, instead of in the domestic system where they usually lived in the rural areas, in the factory system, the factories were usually in an urban setting. So they're usually in the city. So the workers would have to move usually to the cities. So think of, if you want an American example, think of the Pittsburgh steel industry in the mid-1900s, where people came to Pittsburgh for the steel mills, and they would work in the steel mills, but the reason they came was to work in the Pittsburgh area. Same thing happened in London, in Great Britain, during the early Industrial Revolution, when the factory system was developed. Another thing is, usually under the domestic system, the worker owned his own tools, so he was more of like a tradesman. So if he was a plumber, he would have all his own wrenches, all his own fittings and everything like that. Or let's say, for a better example, back to the chairs. Like if he made a chair, he was a craftsman and he made chairs, he would have his own spoke shaves, his own files, his own gouges and chisels and things that he would need, his own lathe even. Well, under the factory system, the factory owned the tools. So you used their tools. You didn't have to worry about buying everything for yourself and bringing it to work. It was already at work. So that made things a lot easier for the workers in that sense. There wasn't as much cost involved for the worker himself. Whereas if you were a tradesman in the domestic system, you had to pay a lot of costs up front. Another thing was, under the factory system, the worker had very little control over the number of hours that he worked. If you're working for yourself, essentially, or you're working with a very small company or a very small group of people, you have a lot more control over the hours you work. But at a factory, where there are hundreds of people, you do your job, and if you don't have your job done in the factory setting, for a bigger company, you just work until it's done. The factory sets the hours, the factory tells you when to come into work, when you can leave, what breaks you can take. And lastly, under the factory system, there's really, you don't get to control whether you work with your family or not. That's up to the business that's hiring. Under the domestic system, you had a lot more control over whether or not you worked with your family, whether or not it was a father and son venture, for example, or husband and wife worked together. But under the factory system, usually the husband went off to worked at the factory for however many hours he had to, and then he came home from work to his family at the end of the day. Okay, now for the next subject, or if you want another subheading, that would be the development of industrialism. And the first thing we need to talk about is iron and steel production, because one of the most widely used materials in all of these industrial projects was steel and iron. And iron production initially was very costly, but Britain had a lot of iron ore. That was one of their most abundant natural resources, but it was not very cost effective to use iron to make things initially, because when they first smelted iron, when they would melt down iron and put it into useful shapes, they used charcoal to try to heat iron up to its melting point. And this was a really costly process. Later they began to use coke, which it's a coal byproduct, which is what's used today in steel making. Henry Bessemer makes a breakthrough in the smelting process, and he actually develops steel. And the process that's used today, a lot of times in the steel industry, is the Bessemer process, which he would actually, to help get impurities out of the iron. So it makes it a stronger metal because there are fewer impurities in it. He would shoot a jet of air into the middle of the molten iron, and that would cause the impurities to solidify and float to the top. And also he would add a few other ingredients like carbon and some other metals to make steel, which was much stronger and more useful than iron, and it was less brittle as well. And once Bessemer developed this process, Britain went from, in 1860, Britain produced about 125,000 tons of steel. That may sound like a lot, but if you look at by 1913, during the times they were using the Bessemer process, their steel production went up to 32 million tons of steel from 125,000 in 1860. So during the Industrial Revolution, steel production went through the roof after Bessemer developed this process. Another thing that we should talk about is new sources of power. The most notable source of power during the Industrial Revolution was steam, the steam engine. Now, James Watt gets a lot of credit for developing the first steam engine, but he actually didn't. You need to know James Watt. He developed the first practical steam engine, the first steam engine that was actually useful to anyone. Thomas Newcomen developed a steam engine, but it used so much coal because it was so inefficient that the only place that they could use his steam engine at was at coal mines, where they had a massive supply of coal. James Watt makes the steam engine more efficient, so it's able to be used in factories. And then people start using it for boats, which we'll talk about in a minute, and they also use it for locomotives or trains, which it really, the steam engine, which is a new source of power, allows new forms of transportation to be developed. And these forms of transportation allow the products that are made in the Industrial Revolution to be transported to new areas, and it really makes shipping the product from one part of the country to another, or even from one country to another, much easier and much more cost effective. The next subheading in this section is going to be transportation. And the most notable person that made developments in the transportation field with steam power is the man who invented the steamboat. Now, I'll give you a second to think of who that was. I can't obviously hear your answer, but I'll be impressed if you know. The man who invented the steamboat was Robert Fulton. He was the first person to successfully take the idea of using steam power and use it for motion, particularly motion on a boat. People didn't like the idea of the steamboat. They actually thought Robert Fulton was making a big mistake. They called it Fulton's Folly when he was developing his steamboat. Some people thought that it wouldn't really go anywhere. Some people thought it was going to be too heavy and the boat was going to sink. Some people thought the boat was just going to explode. So everybody essentially was rooting against Robert Fulton, or at least they thought this was a really bad idea. However, when Robert Fulton tested his steamboat, it outperformed the other boats that were using either sail power or were being rowed. It greatly outperformed them. So much so that very shortly thereafter, many people started using the steamboat. And the steamboat is the precursor to other forms of motion involving steam, particularly the railroad with the locomotive. But anyway, not long after Robert Fulton successfully tested the steamboat, steamboats were becoming very common. They were used in canals. They were used eventually to make transatlantic voyages. They were used to transport goods up and down rivers, particularly the Mississippi. And if you're interested in Mark Twain as an author, Mark Twain recounts part of his life being a steamboat pilot on the Mississippi River in the book Life on the Mississippi. So anyway, the steamboat becomes essential in America to transportation, but it also becomes essential in Britain with transportation on the Thames River, with transatlantic transportation, and with transportation across the English Channel. So Another form of transportation that doesn't involve steam power is transportation using flight. And you need to know Orville and Wilbur Wright, W-R-I-G-H-T, the Wright brothers. They were from America. And in 1903, they make their first successful test flight. And very shortly thereafter, they start making great advancements. Within a year, they go from making, in 1903, I believe it was like 120 feet they flew in the air. To the next year, they ended up making a flight of a couple miles. And flight just kept improving. But again, just like with Robert Fulton and the steamboat, people did not like the idea of the Wright brothers and trying to develop flight. They would say things like, if God had intended us to fly, he would have given us wings. And they thought that flight was a dangerous thing, or that it was futile, there was no way it would work. However, the Wright brothers persevered, and after they successfully flew their planes, it wasn't very long until there were commercial flights available. And then we'll talk a little bit later, I believe toward the end of the chapter, about the implications of Lindbergh and his flight across the Atlantic, but we're not going to get there yet. The last thing in transportation we should talk about is the automobile. Now, Henry Ford gets the credit for mass producing the automobile. There were automobiles before Henry Ford. In fact, in America, in 1896, there were 4 cars in the country. 4. Henry Ford in 1908 starts making his famous Model T car, and by the time we get to the 1920s, there are millions of automobiles in America. So we go from 4, and then less than 30 years later, there are millions of automobiles, and Henry Ford is the one who's responsible for that, because mass production actually drives the cost of the car down so the average person can afford it. Now let's talk about mass production for a minute. So this is a subheading, you should put this in your notes, mass production. There were several things that made mass production successful, and several things that resulted from mass production. The first thing that made mass production possible was automation. A-U-T-O-M-A-T-I-O-N. Automation, which is using machines to do work. And instead of several people doing a task in a factory, now one person would just have to make sure the machine was functioning properly to do the task. Another thing was interchangeable parts. Before the advent of interchangeable parts, if you had a machine, all the parts had to be made, if they were of metal, by a blacksmith, or if they weren't, by a craftsman. And so you would have this machine that would have several special made parts. And if one would break, you'd have to make another one, or you'd have to get another one special made. With interchangeable parts, they were all made to the same specification, so you could have an extra or several extras on hand. So if one piece breaks, just put a new one in there, and the machine's ready to go again. So this meant that there were fewer stoppages of the machines whenever they would break, and it meant production went way up. The third thing, and this one's very important, is something called division of labor. Division of labor. Now, before division of labor, when a product was made, usually a skilled craftsman would make it from start to finish. So if you had a chair, one guy would work on the whole chair from start to finish. He would make the legs, he would make the seat, he would make the back, and then he would put it all together. Now, with division of labor, you had different people who each had their own task in the process. So one person might make the chair back, one person might make the chair legs, one person might make the seat, and one person might assemble it all together. And this made production actually speed up, because one person, if they make the whole thing, they're not really an expert at everything in it. So it takes them longer to make it. But if you have someone just making chair legs all day long, all they do is make chair legs, they get very, very quick at it. So that means that more products are produced more quickly. And division of labor, I think, is one of the things that makes mass production very successful. However, I think the biggest factor in this is the assembly line. And the credit for this goes to Henry Ford. He's the guy that really makes the assembly line work well.